it's a very odd thing. On the one hand, a lot of the current campus dysfunctions and sicknesses is a instantiation of a very pseudo-sophisticated discourse of post-structuralism and the spawn of Derrida and Foucault. At the same time, you mentioned cultural appropriation, which is truly one of the most civilization-destroying concepts to have come out of the campus left. And it is based on an extraordinarily primitive idea of the self as something that is somehow contaminated. There's a sort of an essence there that is authentic and can be stolen. You know, that you can steal my identity through language, or a name can steal an identity. It's a very bizarre thing, and it's a blindness to the fact that one of the beauties of human society is the role playing. It's irony, it's wit, it's the fact that human beings take on different roles at different times. Castiglione wrote a book, Il Cortigiano, the courtier, talking about what it is for an aristocrat, how he should bear himself, and he talks about sprezzatura, the sort of a lightness of being that should be our ideal, of an awareness of play, of possibility. And these campus yahoos are unable to think of differences of degree. At this very moment, there is a Harvard law professor who is being investigated by the Harvard bureaucrats because he has the temerity to represent the accused sexual predator Harvey Weinstein. He also oversees a Harvard undergraduate dorm. And the students at Harvard under his tutelage at the dorm had a complete nervous breakdown because somehow by serving in a professional role of representing Harvey Weinstein, he is somehow carrying into the dorm the essence of rape. And they're unable to understand that, no, he's playing a role that is essential in due process, in restraining the potentially tyrannical power of the state, without which we have no guarantees of justice. And yet these students think of this Ronald Sullivan's professor as somehow a bearer of the essence of rape culture because they have an extraordinarily primitive view of what it is to be a human being.
Well, it's a fragile view.
It's fragile.
You know, and the question, at least in part, is like what accounts for the fragility?
Yeah.
They're so defensive.
It's but you know, I don't quite buy the fragility argument, which is saying it's just like snowflakes and they're overparented. I think what's at stake here is ideological war.
I should have said shallowness then.
Okay, right. I think that they are using the language of psychological fragility for something that is far more dangerous and malign, which is to try and take down Western civilization.
You've both alluded to how the dominant views on the academy have far more widely reaching consequences than that which is simply contained. There's often a critique to, some people would say, well, it's just the ivory tower, it's a kind of sequestered problem, it's contained in a certain sense, it has borders, but both of you, it seems to me, have a keen sense that what happens in the university spreads, in fact, in a certain sense, is distributed or disseminated principally from the university to everywhere else. And I'm wondering if you could each say a few words about the consequences for however you might characterize those dysfunctions, those maladies internally in the university, what their consequences are, both psychologically for the student and then broader culturally, whether artistically, politically, or otherwise.
Well, let us count the ways. I mean, there's hardly a day goes by that is not some real world manifestation of academic victim politics. right now we have this absurd crusade going on of former Vice President Joe Biden for acting like a normal human being, for acting like an older man who's a politician and is physical and uses his hands to express himself. I have not seen a single image yet that comes anywhere close to sexual predation. And yet we're going through this massive meltdown because somehow he's engaged in rape culture. Look at the hysteria that greeted this incident of the boys from a Catholic school in Covington, Kentucky, who were visiting the Washington Monument and happened to get in between a battle between some kooky black nationalist extremists and some Native American activists. And there was one image that was caught that was a boy exercising enormous self-restraint as an Indian activist pounds his drum right in his face, that was seized upon by the elites as the very embodiment of white patriarchal cisnormative privilege. And for a few days, there was an ecstatic self-indulgence in finally we've got a real-world example of white male privilege, until the story fell apart. We are also seeing the STEM fields in Silicon Valley. Meritocracy is under assault. Mm-hmm. The reigning assumption of academic identity politics is that, well, there's three. That gonads and melanin are the most important things about a human being, that discrimination based on gonads and melanin are the defining features of American society, and any disparity in proportional representation, be it of females and males or of different minority and ethnic groups in any American institution, is by definition the result of discrimination against females and minorities. So what does this mean for the STEM fields? It means that every single big tech company, whether it's Google or Microsoft, are twisting themselves into knots to try to hire, to create gender equity. There was a HR manager at YouTube who was fired because he refused to go along with the edict from on high to interview only females, blacks, and Hispanics for entry-level engineering jobs. Who knows how many highly qualified white or Asian males were passed over that could have given us some breakthrough in, say, energy efficiency to take on climate change, because these tech firms are now putting obeisance to the demands of identity politics above meritocratic hiring.
So there's something that's really crucial about the idea of the assault on meritocracy, because I think one of the defining features of the campus pathology is in fact an assault on the idea of competence itself.
Yes, absolutely.
And I've been trying to untangle the logic behind that, to lay it out, and at the same time trying to understand how we might define when the left goes too far. This has actually been a technical problem. Like we all understand, if we have a modicum of knowledge about the 20th century, that the left can clearly go too far. We obviously know that the right can go too far, and the conditions under which the right can go too far seem to be fairly well understood. They tend to involve claims of superiority, intrinsic superiority based on group identity. That's the dividing line, I think, for the pathology of the right. For the pathology of the left, it's much more difficult. It seems like it's more like a combination of ideas that produce a kind of genocidal toxicity if they're left to run to their full extent. But of all those vague ideas that cause immense trouble, the most deadly is the notion that unequal outcomes are evidence of systemic oppression. It's pathological first because it denies the idea that there are intrinsic differences between people that may play a role in those differences in outcome that are independent of oppression and prejudice. Now, we should say, as reasonably intelligent people, that hierarchies, meritocratic or not, are prone to their various pathologies and to their corruption by power, and that it certainly is the case that throughout history and even now, the most qualified person doesn't necessarily get the job, and that's often for reasons that have nothing to do with their qualifications. So they're discriminated against for prejudicial reasons. That happens with less attractive people, for example. It happens with shorter people. It happens with people who are more introverted. There's many, many reasons why the best person doesn't necessarily get the job. But to say that that happens sometimes is not anything like saying that that's the characteristic function of the hierarchies of the functional West. It seems to me to be self-evident that most of the organizations that we have put together with such great difficulty are unbelievably functional, remarkably or even miraculously functional, and that it's unquestionable that a large proportion of them are devoted to solving problems that everyone wants to have solved. I mean, people who take care of the sewage, for example, are a good example of that. I mean, we actually do take care of our bodily waste. That actually works. We actually have electrical systems, power systems that function. We have infrastructure that is reliable. I mean, our society works, and everyone's happy about that because everyone recognizes that, well, it's not so good to freeze in the winter and to die of heat prostration in the summer, and it's not so good to walk, in 10 inches of filth like you might have in London in 1750. And we've organized structures that take care of those problems, and we all see that, at least to some degree, the reason that these organizations work is because we have encouraged, allowed, and rewarded the people who are capable of running organizations of that sort to actually be the ones that run them, hence the meritocracy. So, and one of the consequences of that, in combination with the fact that there are intrinsic differences between people, is that there isn't equality of outcome.